I remember during your campaign you said that you were going to have Bugliosi be your special prosecutor.
That's correct,
if you
yeah.
were elected Attorney General.
That's true. I mean, what happened is that, I mean, I did not have a background in criminal law. I did a couple of criminal defense cases, but there's no way I could have done this without, A, reading his book, looking at the evidence and the legal framework to see if it really was possible to prosecute a former president once he was out of office. And I read the book, and Robin had said to me, you know, there's something in there about how any district attorney, or no, she didn't tell me that. All she said is there's something in there that we can do in our different states. And so she gives me the book. And so I read that particular section, which said any attorney general or any district attorney, or state's attorney, as they're called here, can do it, can prosecute the president in a state criminal court. I mean, the ideal place would be in federal court, but the way things are going in Washington right now, you know, because of the power struggles that go on, he thought it was highly unlikely that it was going to happen on the federal level. So he had come up with this incredibly imaginative approach for actually doing this prosecution in a state court. So I ended up reading it carefully, thinking this is worth meeting the man. I found out when I called him that he did not have anybody in mind at that time. And it just occurred to me that, you know, first of all, I'm not a sitting attorney general. I was running for attorney general. And I thought to myself, you know, there aren't going to be many that are going to sort of raise their hand and say, yeah, I'm going to risk my job to do this. Whereas all I was doing was risking a campaign. And I thought it was important enough to raise the issues. So I took it up. I met Bugliosi, who very fortuitously was planning to come to the East Coast right around the time when I had to, you know, step up to the plate and announce my candidacy. And so I met him in Andover, Mass., where there had been a large conference where journalists and lawyers had convened, and it was at the Massachusetts School of Law in Andover, Massachusetts, and the title was Planning for the Prosecution of High-Level Government Officials for War Crimes. And so I got to meet other attorneys. I got to sort of check out Bugliosi. Did they think that Bugliosi's theories were viable? And then I got to meet this great prosecutor himself, and did so, and we hit it off right away. He's a very serious man, and he heavily documents his books, and so did I. So I brought a copy of Thy Will Be Done, with its you know, pages and pages of footnotes, and he showed me his book. You know, if you take on the powers that be, you got to footnote everything. You got to be absolutely sure that what you're saying is accurate, because they'll try to go after you and discredit you. So we had sort of that common bond. Bugliosi was a lawyer that happened to be a writer, and I was a writer that happened to be a lawyer. And we combined forces, and he came up to Burlington when I announced my campaign in September, I think it was 19th, 2008. I got started very late and only really had about a month to campaign, but it was worth it. I was very pleased to be able to raise the issue, even though I suspected that there would be a fair amount of hostility and derision. And I met some wonderful people along the way. I didn't know that my campaign would touch such a nerve, and it did. I got responses from people all over the country cheering me on. A lot of people had been very, very disillusioned with the Democratic Party because it dropped the ball on impeachment, and they were distressed about that. So they're very glad that there were some people, namely Bugliosi and myself, that were going out there and saying that George Bush and Dick Cheney had really gone far too far in sneering at the rule of law, of making up laws along the way, of giving the president dictatorial powers, of spying on dissenters, and of torturing detainees. It was appalling. And what I discovered is that thousands of Americans felt the same way, and that's the reason why after the race was over and I lost predictably, I figured there's a book in this. I want to pursue this theme of holding our government officials accountable for their crimes in office.
You mentioned Bugliosi's footnotes in his book. I think lawyers have a tendency to put a lot more in footnotes than many writers do. I noticed in your book here, too, that a lot of information is in the footnotes.
Yes.
Anyone who reads the books wants to look at the footnotes also. Here on footnote 265, it says, with regard to Watergate, there is a growing body of evidence that Nixon, for all his abuses of power, was actually overthrown by a silent coup of even more powerful and abusive people who wanted to control the presidency. I was impressed by that. I was wondering who are these people that overthrew Nixon, and are they connected to what we have now, the neocons and the Bush and maybe Reagan?
Yeah. Well, actually, it's all quite well documented in a book called, wait a minute, it's just slipping my mind, Family of Secrets by Russ Baker, who's an investigative journalist. I know Russ. And Family of Secrets is the Bush dynasty. That's what it's about. And he began to really investigate the Bushes because he'd been abroad in Europe. I think he was teaching journalism, and people would come up to him and say, how could the American people elect this man, this idiot? I mean, that's what they thought. They thought he was a stupid man, and who was getting the United States in all sorts of trouble. And Baker realized he really didn't know that much about it. So he really probed very deeply. And one of the periods that he probed was the Watergate period. And there'd already been a book out called Silent Coup that posited that Nixon was actually the victim of a setup. And so Russ explored it even further. And what it comes down to is that Nixon was very useful to the Bushes, both George H.W., well, particularly George H.W., who sought the presidency. And he had taken his family, and I'm talking about Bush Sr., to Texas after World War II. Why? Because Texas was oil. And Texas was a bastion of independent producers. And so Bush Sr., whose family is a family of investment bankers from the East, saw an opportunity in Texas. And at the same time, he got interested in politics and began to realize that the way to rise in politics in the Republican Party was to sort of harness the resentments of the independent producers who actually railed against the Eastern elites. And one of the vehicles for rising to power that Bush Sr. recognized very early on was Richard Nixon. And so you'll read in Family of Secrets how using Nixon, Bush Sr. was able to elevate his own political standing and getting into the Washington elite, and at one point being the UN ambassador, and at the same time, being out of Washington at the same time that Watergate's happening